Hello and welcome to another conversation at Preach magazine. My name is Tanya Stead. I'm the editor here, and I'm also the content manager for the Leaders of Worship and Preachers Trust, the charity behind Preach magazine. It is an absolute delight to welcome Chris Doran. Doran to the conversation as we discuss his latest book and everything to do with climate change and climate migration. So Chris, just a quick blurb about who you are. Chris is Professor of Religion and Sustainability at Pepperdine University, the founder and coordinator of Pepperdine's Sustainability Academic Program, which is the largest multidisciplinary program in the history of the university. He is the author of Hope in the Age of Climate Change, Creation Care This Side of Resurrection, and his new book, Climate Migration, a Christian call to action in a warming world. Chris, thank you for writing this book, I think, and for coming on and having this conversation with us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here.
This book, the issue of climate change, we know it's there. Are we taking it seriously enough? But just briefly, because you've written a book before and you've got this one and you still to bring this issue to light, can you explain what prompted you to write this book?
Yes. My previous book was sort of about how Christians might think about creation care in general and sort of dealing with anthropogenic issues, but also with issues related to non-human creatures. And so one of the things that I was doing as I was researching that book was I went to the Maldives for the start of a sabbatical. I was grateful to be able to have that release time. And I went to a place in the Maldives that is only about 7 natural feet above sea level. And sort of being there and realizing that several hundred thousands of people are going to be without a home sometime between 2050 and 2100 started shifting me down a path to saying, well, that maybe is a second book that I need to think about. And during the 2020-21 school year here in the U.S., I did a class, the first class I know of on the West Coast about climate migration, and particularly taught it from a distinctly Christian point of view. And one of the things that we sort of thought about throughout that class was, why was no one talking about this? And I think there's definitely just some ignorance, not intentional on the part of just many people in church leadership positions around the planet. But for those who were talking about it, I was very impressed by their candor and their rigor, but also equally distressed by how few of them were actually within the Christian orbit. There were a lot of secular folks and a lot of really good people in the humanitarian space that were talking about this, but very, very few, if any, that were either in the sort of Protestant Christian space, the Roman Catholic space, or the Orthodox space. So I just thought, I had a previous dean of my college say, if you don't like the textbooks out there, write your own. And so this was sort of my attempt to write something for, I have a mostly Christian audience at my university, but also the churches I work with in California and other parts of the U.S. is start to get them to think about these kind of issues.
And I think it's so important thinking about us humans too. But could you just briefly summarize, as you define it in your book, what is a climate migrant?
Yeah, so this became one of the really interesting things to deal with, is what is a climate migrant. There are sort of 2 umbrella terms that cover this in legal and non-legal spaces right now across the planet. It's climate refugees and climate migrants. I kind of work with the United Nations International Organization for Migration definition, that is sort of the movement of a person or a group of persons predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment, or perhaps slow change, whether that's within their own nation state or across an international border. But the other thing that I settled on the term migrant rather than refugee was that some community members in the South Pacific and Vanuatu and Kiribati and others started using the language of migration with dignity. And in that terminology, some of the local leaders there argued that refugee language made them feel victimized. Whereas migrant language, even if it's not codified internationally the same way, seem to have dignity to it. And so I sort of settled in on that, and I have a bit in the book about why I settled in more and that. But the sort of large pieces, even those folks, for example, in the humanitarian space that use climate refugees for legal reasons, I don't think they're doing anything wrong. But the term migrant has been so part of the political landscape of the United States over the last several years. And then that plus the issue of the leaders in the South Pacific using that terminology, that's kind of where I settled.
Yeah, it makes sense. What are some examples of someone that might then eventually identify as a climate migrant?
Yeah, so, as we live here in the United States, for example, where I'm at on the West Coast, I mentioned this in the book, I've evacuated from at least 5 different wildfires in my area. And so I'm forced with the idea of, am I myself a climate migrant? Well, my home is almost burned down 3 different times out of those 5. It has not. And so I've been very blessed to not have to deal with some of the complications that come with even just the most recent fire here in January of 2025. And so as I was thinking through that, we think about 2 broad categories: the sudden events, like the ones of like wildfires, or on the East Coast of the United States, hurricanes, or massive flooding events. And then you think about sort of, those would be like sudden onset events, sometimes with the UN language. And others are more slow onset events, often thought about like drought or famine, the things that take a long time to manifest. And what we're seeing in both of those situations is that people are moving because of those things. Strangely enough, fewer people move because of sudden onset events, and more people move due to slow onset events like drought or famine. But in the U.S., what we're starting to see is that the sudden events like massive flooding or wildfires, wealthier people can now make a decision to move a little bit differently, or if not mostly differently than those who are lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. And so to me, those are the kinds of things that you need to think about as you're sort of maybe entering this space for the first time. Wildfire, extreme heat, sea level rise, increase in flooding events that might lead to, a feast or famine kind of back and forth. Those are happening on just about every continent on the planet that we inhabit, some version of those. And those are the things that I argue may not be the only reason that someone moves. But when we step back and look at it, we realize that people are moving now because of those reasons, and will continue to move due to those reasons. And when I was doing the research, when something as secular as the World Bank says that there's at least 140 million people in parts of Latin America and Africa going to move due to climate issues, it sort of sobered me into thinking that maybe we should all be talking about this a little bit more. And that's not even the whole planet. That's just one subsection of 2 different continents.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think for our listeners, we'll remember that during our summer we had, I'll call it a wave of heat waves, and reaching temperatures that the UK has almost never seen. I mean, 40 degrees Celsius, I'm not sure what that's in Fahrenheit, but, it is everywhere, and we can't run away from it. And this idea of people who have been forced to migrate because of the changes in their climate, like you said, otherwise slow or sudden onset, I think it's mind-blowing, and something that we really need to pay attention to. Your book is not just a textbook about climate and climate change and what a migrant is. It's much more than that. It's a Christian call to action. And thankfully, most of the book is from a theological perspective. What examples do you pull out from the Bible, characters or people in the Bible or people groups that are climate migrants themselves?
Yeah, one of the things that in my tradition, I'm part of the larger American Restoration movement and the Churches of Christ within that, is that we take seriously the idea that good theological education and reflection starts from biblical sources. And so I've been shaped by that since very early on in life, and to continue to kind of work from that angle methodologically. And so as I was thinking about this topic, I was reading scripture from that perspective. Where are the migrants and what are they doing? And it was so amazing to me to see so many stories about migrants the way that we would tend to think about them now, as going from rural zones to cities or across what we would now call international boundaries, which wouldn't have existed in the ancient world. But you have stories like Noah moving. You have stories like Abraham moving. You have stories like Ruth moving, Moses moving. And then one of the ones that I cover in the book to sort of think about this as a white male is Jesus as a migrant of color moving across borders, and how Protestants in the U.S. in particular have struggled with that piece of the Jesus of Nazareth story, is that Jesus is a person of color, sort of moved across borders, as it were. Again, borders didn't exist in the same way in 2,000 years ago as they do now. But those are just some of the examples of the story. And I think one of the things that I was sort of really impacted upon is a Roman Catholic movement, theology of migration movement, and sort of thinking about how much of our faith journey really is about movement. It's either movement towards God or movement away from God. And how migrants in those stories, Moses he moves away from his community. He moves back to his community. As one scholar puts it, he's a coyote, is the kind of language of leading illegal people across, a boundary. And that coyote language is something that we use here in the U.S. for Mexican migrants that might be fleeing and being escorted by this. And all of that language, while it's not necessarily 21st century language put into the Bible, the stories of movement are so profound. For example, just really quickly, like the story of Ruth, when I read it from that lens, you think, here's a story of a woman who, in the story, decides voluntarily to be this hospitable person when she was not morally obliged to do so. She had committed herself to her husband and to that family, but they're no longer there. So she has no legal or moral obligation. And yet she returns to a home that's not her own. And it's, when you start thinking about scripture from that perspective, I think it opens up another kind of hermeneutical insight into why, for example, on the North American continent, so many Mexicans who are migrating from Central America or Mexico, or Central Americans who are migrating to Mexico, the Roman Catholic ones in particular sort of attach themselves to stories of Jesus as a migrant. And I just found that as a white male who grew up in the U.S. to be so compelling to see people reading scripture from these various points of view, from life experiences that were not my own.
Yeah, and I think that's something we also need to pay attention to. Some of the migrants, I know here in the UK, there's been a huge influx of Chinese immigrants coming to the UK and establishing their Chinese church. They are Christians coming in, and they can identify with Jesus and his story. They can identify with Moses. They can identify with Ruth. These struggles of finding a new home, trying to settle, and the hurt and the grief of trying to do that and trying to do that well. So yeah, I think that's just something to pay attention to as well. And I think that's something we can bring into our sermons. We can understand the different cultures that we are interacting with, and the pressures that they're going through. I think after you outline what climate migration is, you talk about the negative ideas about migrants, and then you go into Christian values. So could you just briefly touch on what are the 5 Christian values that you're challenging your readers with?
Yeah, so I wasn't trained as what in academia often is called a virtue ethics or virtue ethicist background, but I just sort of have been touched by this kind of idea that the virtues that Christians have practiced for so long seem to be out of vogue, as it were, in the U.S. these days, and so we just don't talk about that so often. And so I could have had more than 5. I know my initial editor and some other friends of mine wanted me to get out to about 10, and you could have a never-ending list of virtues. But the 5 that I settled on were hospitality, solidarity, courage, justice, and hope. And to me, what those 5 help do is to remind us, A, that no virtue within Christianity sort of exists on its own. So there's the interlocking or interdependency on each one of those work together, and I try to lay that out in the book. But I'll just give a quick example. Like hospitality for me, there's a risk not only to the guest who coming into a new space, but there's a risk for the host. And one of the things that Christians in the early centuries talked about is not being hospitable is a risk of not showing God's love. And so what does that say to you as the host if you're not willing to take the risk of taking someone into your life or having dinner with someone or clothing someone, etc.? And what does that do to you and your relationship with God? And then in the chapter on courage, I really highlight not just the female characters in the Bible who show incredible amounts of courage in really difficult circumstances like Ruth and Esther, but how women across the planet are disproportionately burdened by climate migration. And so trying to show some stories there and to kind of help hopefully ministers and pastors understand that those women who are migrating have such an incredible heavy burden that they're already bearing. And so what can we do to not only highlight the courage of them just trying to feed their families, but maybe to be more hospitable and stand in solidarity with them when they do come to our borders or come into our cities, and realize things just as simple as like literacy rates for women across the planet are much lower than they are for males. So how can we help with just simple things like translating documents or making sure that medical supplies or sanitation supplies or pregnancy supplies are available for women? And I think when I've talked to churches here in the U.S. about that, that's not something they're always clued into, that women would be disproportionately burdened by this. But sort of highlighting the courage of women and hoping to stand in solidarity with them and be hospitable is just kind of one example of how those virtues might work together.
Yeah. And I think that's wise and practical advice, really, really thinking about how you can just have those few small things in your church that really make a difference, really, really bring some dignity to those women. I really appreciate that. And one of my questions was about, the injustices and violences that are disproportionately against women and sometimes children too. And I think, I really appreciate that the book is bringing that to light. But this narrative of oppression, marginalization, and injustices towards migrants, any type of migrants, are as old as time. It's not just in Jesus' day, but way before that as well. Is there any hope for change that you have for this or future generations?
Yeah, you're asking someone who wrote a first book about hope and then included that in this chapter. And on my best days, sometimes I'm not as hopeful as I would like to be. I started off as a scientist, and so looking at climate science from that perspective, my skepticism can be very high at times when you look at the consequences. But, to me, if I can be so bold, I can think in time period, there's certain time periods throughout the last 2,000 years of Christian history where xenophobia and racism and misogyny have always been there, but there's certainly been highlighted moments where they seem to be sort of, as I might put it, more pronounced or more publicly acceptable in ways that future generations find intolerable. And I kind of wonder if we're in one of those moments in the U.S. right now where we have certain cultural and political factors in place that make certain types of marginalization unfortunately popular to do and to scapegoat those who have very little power. And so to me, that here in the U.S., I can remember I taught my climate migration class during the fall of 2024 when some of the most callous and disgusting things were being said by presidential candidates about migrants, and I was teaching a class on it, and it was sort of a real world example of how do you remain hopeful in that. And so one of the things I said in that class is what I would say to ministers, and I have said to ministers and preachers since then, is if we hear that loudness in our society and we as Christians are not responding with the same sort of voice, volume as it were, then I don't think we're doing our job. If we're not here to remind people that all human beings are made in the image of God, and we're not sort of shouting that as forcefully as those who are demonizing migrants, then I kind of wonder how people outside of the Christian world are viewing us. And how future generations, this is the kind of challenge to my students. I say, what will future generations say about us if we're not on the record for speaking into this with the power and privilege that we might have to do such? And so I think that's where I derive my hope, is that the message of Jesus is pretty clear on who we're supposed to stand with. So we don't have any sort of uncertainty about that. The uncertainty is about whether we want to take on some of the social stigma or some of the possible violence towards us and those who have power and privilege to be able to speak about these things out loud. And so for me, there's lots of people in my own community and communities around the US, and I know communities in Europe and other places where even if it's just small pockets of very powerful voices have spoken on behalf of migrants and those who are marginalized. Some days I feel as if the secular voices are far more powerful than the Christian ones, which makes me sort of a little teary-eyed at the end of the day. But I do know that Christian voices are speaking about this, even if they're not public. They're in their own communities or their own parishes and such. But I think we need to be more vocal about that.
I think that's great advice. Don't be afraid to speak up for those people. On the flip side, you highlight a few positives to migrants, which I think is really helpful. But could you highlight a few of those positives?
Yeah, so one of the things that we deal with quite a lot in the U.S. is this idea that migrants will that are coming here, especially from Central America, Mexico, South America, is that they're going to take all of our jobs, and they're violent people, and not just violent people, the worst of the worst. And, one of the things that the data shows is that migrants, at least the ones coming to the U.S., and most studies show this across the planet, frequently bring, new intellectual abilities, labor abilities to a receiving nation economy. And you don't actually see a massive crash of the economy, but you see a burgeoning of the economy because usually more labor helps an economy be more efficient. And so that's just sort of one economic thing. But I think when you think about it from a personal point of view, you kind of think about people that are coming tend to have things like culture, like food, art, language, new world views, just in general, that sort of are added to that. And if we think about that from a theological position, people's new insights about who God is, or for example, what I said earlier about Roman Catholic Mexicans saying, I see Jesus as a migrant primarily, like that should stimulate me to kind of think about things differently even if I'm just a person in a parish and not thinking about this all the time. And then the other one that I deal with in the U.S. a lot is that the idea that crime rates amongst migrants are much higher than the established or receiving nation. And that's just not true whatsoever, at least in the U.S. And I think that's important for us as Christians to know at least some basic facts to kind of understand what that is. And that's what we saw in the U.S. with these unfortunate mass deportations, is that people were sort of on board with these massive policies until they found out that someone in their own community that they've known for 30 years is going to be deported. And you think, well, all that value they were giving to the community, all that value they were sort of pouring into maybe their own kids or their neighbors' kids or their school districts or what have you, became very personal very quickly. And so what I think I try to encourage ministers to do is, you got to have some basic understanding of the facts about the economy and crime rates and such, but there's probably very personalized examples in people's home churches, congregations, et cetera, of migrants that we don't even think about as migrants because they're just part of our community. And how can we make sure to be thoughtful about that?
And I think just give think to if it is a climate migrant that is moving away from an area that's facing desertification or a famine or anything like that, they'll be bringing those skills that they would have used in their home country or home state to yours. And I think we shouldn't overlook that. And one of the things I've encountered is the translation of the Bible sometimes into English leaves some words sort of with the wrong connotations. And I wanted to challenge you with this question because I really like your insight. And it's when you reference what Jesus said in Matthew 25:45, and he references the least of these, is there a danger of us thinking of migrants of any type as lesser or inferior because of that use of the least of these, and what you understand by that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think there is a fear of that. As you said, it's very difficult to find a better English translation than that, just because of the way the Greek works there. Um, but I think there's some opportunity for analysis of one's own power and privilege and one's own station in life, as it were. Like for example, for me, what I said in the beginning of the book, I won a geographic lottery I didn't enter. I was born into the United States in the 20th century with electricity and running water and all the other things that come with living in the U.S., good or bad. And so when you think about that passage, you think about who are the people that are not like me immediately. And that doesn't mean that those people are bad, but I think we have to stop and do some reflection about, which geographic lottery did we win or not win, and how do we sort of understand our Christian responsibility within that. The other thing that when I talk about that passage with my students, there's not an immediate parallel with the sort of Hebrew triad, but to think about the widows, the orphans, and the strangers, or the aliens, or depending on which translation you have. I tend to use something like strangers or migrants in that third category. My guess is that, when Jesus' audience heard the least of these, at least the Jewish audience, that's what they were hearing. They were hearing widows, orphans, and strangers or migrants. And to me, I remind my students of that all the time, because I think those categories are still real categories in our society today. And it's easy to scapegoat those categories, but it's also easy to dismiss those categories unless we're a part of one of those. And I think one of the things that is so impactful and so powerful about the Christian witness is that if we were to see the face of Jesus in those people, we somehow can be transformed ourselves. And I think that's part of what it means to kind of live through the journey of faith, as I talk about in my own journey in the book. Is like, how do I get closer, not just to the mind of Christ, but to the acting like Christ? And so to me, I think that's part of what that passage sort of stimulates for me, is not to look down on those, but to ask myself, how do I serve those who do not win a geographic or socioeconomic or gender lottery that sort of prizes some folks and not others?
Yeah, thank you. That's a humble response and quite helpful. I think the book brings out so much to think about, and I've got way too many sticky notes to probably get through in the time. So I guess that's a challenge to anybody listening, that you need to read the book. Although there are American references in a lot of the places, it does still apply to sometimes how us in the UK think of migrants, and some of the stories I've heard. They're going to take our jobs, and they're just going to sponge off the government, and all of those things. But really, it's a big challenge to approach what's happening through a different lens, to think about how climate change is worldwide, and how people are not only fleeing injustices of war or political or anything like that. They are also fleeing a way of life that is not sustainable, that's not going to support them, in reference to how the climate is just changing. You were talking about the Maldives, and I've actually had a conversation a couple of days ago with a friend who's getting married next year, and they've decided their honeymoon needs to be the Maldives because they don't know if they'll ever get that chance again. And I think that really made me think about what is happening in the world. Maldives is not the only example, Chris. You bring out some other examples in your book of places that are facing basically extinction, really. They're going to be underwater. The challenge is that so many of us know that there's a climate problem. We know that things are working. We might not understand or be able to get to the depths of understanding the scientific background to all of this, but yet we still deny. We still think, oh, it's not that bad, or maybe it's not something we need to worry about in our generation. But you outline 3 different types of climate denial. Could you speak about those quickly?
Yeah. So, in that section on climate denial, I sort of use the famous Apostle Thomas, or the so-called doubting Thomas, to kind of think about the issue of climate denial. I think that part of the book, amongst others, is probably going to get me really in trouble with some American churches because climate denial is still, unfortunately, in a large part of the Protestant church here in the U.S. And so it borrows some terminology from some sociologists, and the three types of denial that they talk about are literal denial, interpretive denial, and implicatory denial. And just quickly, literal denial is sort of characterized by the fossil fuel industry, for example, literally paying hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several decades to promote the idea that climate change is not happening. Interpretive denial has been a key characteristic of many politicians here in the U.S. over the last decade and a half or so, is to say, well, climate change is happening, of course, who could dispute that, but is it really all that bad? Or is it really going to happen now? Or can we just wait to do something down the road? So you accept the facts for what they are, but then you don't accept scientists' general interpretation of the facts, and thus you sort of move away from any sort of immediate action. And then the last one, implicatory denial, is the one that I challenge my students with all the time, because I think all of us, Christian or not, or adults or not, or minors, we're all doing it, which is the idea that we know something is happening, but we're not putting that knowledge into action. And so I think it's a good reminder for the church. While churches may not want to think about themselves as denying it in that kind of way, the challenge I have to churches, both here and in other places, is what are you really doing to sort of make sure that you are putting thought into action? And I think that's important, because there's plenty of things in our life that we deny in that implicatory sort of way, whether it's a dentist's appointment or a doctor's visit, or, my students just putting off their exam until the last moment to study for. We know that there's some things are happening. Well, we've known about climate change for, going on 200 years now. And, the last 50 or 60 years in particular, we've known fossil fuel groups in the U.S. have known this since the 1950s. So, there's no sort of room anymore for people to say that we didn't know, at least at the, sort of the Western global North experience. We don't really have any excuse. And so what I try to do with the Thomas part, just to say briefly, Thomas gets a lot of slack from others because he sort of wanted proof. And so that's why he appeals to me as a former scientist, because he's sort of the patron saint of science at some level. Is like, give me proof of something. But what one of the scholars that I use in that part of the chapter talks about is Thomas finally comes to a position of faith without the proof he actually wanted. And so my challenge to churches when I talk to them is, shouldn't we be more like Thomas? Thomas asked for exactly what he wanted. Jesus offered it to him. And instead of sticking his hand in the actual hole, he said he believed, and then not so many words. And so that's what I challenge churches with today, is if you don't think climate change is real, tell me what more evidence do you want? And I get a lot of stunned silence at that point, because I think really what climate issues mostly are about, when we're talking about that level, like my friend Catherine Hayo says, they're mostly about facts, feelings, and identity all at the same time. We're really having multiple conversations about it. And so what I try to get with the climate denial part is to say, if we're saying this is not real, then we're not going to meet the challenge of climate migration over the next, whatever many years are left in this particular decade and in this century. Because to say that people only move for economic reasons is to truncate the experience of hundreds of millions of people around the planet who are already moving due to climate issues.
I think what you've got to say to church leaders today is really take up the challenge, be a voice. Don't deny it any longer. Be part of the change, that you're able to recognize climate migrants, be a voice for them. And just be a voice for our climate. And God's given us this world to look after, and we should be looking after it. So thank you so much for coming on. And I couldn't recommend your book highly enough. So if anyone wants to get a copy, please, can you go online? You'll be able to find it quite quickly. Chris, you have excellent writing ability. So thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.